We actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists.
Because we understand that this future that we all want, that we're all trying to build, really is about the destruction of colonization, white supremacy, and capitalism.
And racism isn't about people being mean to each other. Racism is about how we are distributing resources in these communities and what it means over time. When we say no more business as usual, it's an indicator that we aim to transform this democracy into something that supports all of us, not just some of us. We are not satisfied with the crumbs that may fall from the table of power, and we are not satisfied with merely sitting at the tables of power. In fact, we aim to up and overturn those tables in favor of a new system overall.
I'm talking about like for real abolition, not just watered down DNC version of abolition. We're talking about abolishing the police. We're talking about abolishing ICE. We're talking about abolishing prisons.
If there are no police, are you proposing, or do you see a world with no police, or is it just a different kind of people who enforce laws? What does that mean?
We say abolish the police because we mean abolish the police, right? There's no mincing of language there. There's nothing that we're trying to trick you on.
So a lot of people are asking, well, why defund the police? Why not police reform? So we've tried that. We've tried police reform over many, many years, and still it stays the same.
You might be asking yourselves, what does that have to do with Black Lives Matter? But I'm going to tell you, Black Lives Matter is about transforming our economy and transforming our democracy. And so again, I hope you get a chance to look at that talk a little bit later.
If this country doesn't give us what we want, then we will burn down this system and replace it.
Figure out how to really dismantle our state's attachment and partnership with the police force. We're really challenging a core aspect of racial capitalism at this moment. And it's beautiful to bear witness to that. Hopefully in this moment, we're creating an alternative to our policing. We're creating an alternative to a system of racialized capitalism that we know in light of COVID as well. And in this particular moment, we know that this system cannot sustain us or be able to meet our basic necessities because it's too focused on preserving the interests and needs of the business class. And as long as you have a system that's beholden to the business class, working class and Black and brown folks, we're always going to be an afterthought, and we're always going to be treated as expendable. So it's great to have that.
There's a necessity for racist stereotypes and for racism in capitalism. It will keep being generated as long as there's a necessity for it. You know, I think that culture comes out of the way that we survive. Not only I think that, but a lot of folks think that. Like, you have a fishing village, you're gonna have fishing songs. You have an agricultural village, you're gonna have agricultural songs. The racist culture that we have is necessitated by capitalism. Explain poverty to people in a way that's not systematic. They need to put a behavioral pattern on poverty. One way to do that is to say, look at these others. Look what they do. This is what keeps them poor. When even white workers look at themselves as being poor, they look at themselves in terms of not wanting to act like Black folks.
Part of the discomfort around talking about Black Lives Matter is that it breaks open a fundamental contradiction in this country, which is racism and white supremacy. A real deep-seated disease that this country suffers from that infects all of our society.
And we must make sure that we see real change in this time. And one more point is, remember that this racism, this monster that we've been fighting for years and years is the product of capitalism. That's right! As far as I'm concerned, capitalism has to go.
Capitalism. And before you call me a raving socialist, which many of you will, it's just a fact. When you have an economic system that profits off of people.
And see,
that's right. The USA is the biggest representation of anti-Blackness worldwide. Give me a hell yeah! In order to implement the kind of change that we want people, we need to organize like this every single day. Every single day. It doesn't stop tomorrow, it doesn't stop next week, it doesn't stop next month, 2, 3, 4, 5 months from now. This is an everyday process. And until we keep seeing injustice every day, that same every day, we fight back. What do we do?
You are one of my greatest teachers. I have a bookshelf full of your writings. I want to say thank you for shaping not just our ideas, but the fights that we have on the ground. The people that are locked down in DC right now have been influenced by you. The people that are taking action all across this country have been influenced by you. And I hope that your heart is warmed by knowing that we all know that, and that we're just so forever grateful to you.
At the time you were talking about how capitalism had replaced feudalism and how capitalism itself was doomed because socialism was to replace capitalism as we moved on toward more perfect harmony of communism, supposedly. My question to you is today, do you still see on the horizon the end of capitalism or the end of the idea of private property or the private rights over the rights of the many? Is that still one of your charges, is still one of your issues of concern?
Contradictions within capitalism also pointing toward another possibility, towards other possibilities. And I see that. I see that now more than ever before.
Abolition is really about rethinking the kind of future we want, the social future, the economic future, the political future. It's about revolution, I would argue. To imagine new ways of structuring our institutions, such as, well, not structuring the prison, because the whole point is that we have to abolish that institution in order to begin to envision new ways of addressing the conditions that lead to mass incarceration, that lead to such horrendous tragedies as the
racial capitalism, which is to say all capitalism. It's not a thing, it's a relation. However, if we look back through the history of capitalism as it developed, we see that the understanding that those who own the means of production had of their differences from those whose labor they exploited were understandings that we can recognize today as racial practice. So, all capitalism is racial from its beginning, which is to say the capitalism that we have inherited that is constantly producing and reproducing itself. And it will continue to depend on racial practice and racial hierarchy no matter what. This is another way of saying we can't undo racism without undoing capitalism.
In terms of the nature of that movement, is it a movement about policing? Is it a movement about poverty? Is it a movement about the relationship between the two? How do you see it?
I think that's a really good question. What I see right now, and it's because this is what I've been working on for years, is that we are in a particular moment in history where we are looking at state violence. And I think we can use this moment to look at state violence as a way to look at many other things, such as poverty, such as homelessness. These are not unique to the United States, but something that is, I think, is unique is the ways in which state violence is being uplifted in this moment in history. And I think we have an opening, which doesn't happen very often, to change policy, to change the culture, and to shift some pretty deadly dynamics.
This is really the moment that this broken system could all come crumbling down, but it's up to us to take action and make it happen. We have to bring the crisis to their doorsteps. And we're going to mobilize outside the homes of politicians in the middle of the night to wake them up. That's right, y'all. No justice, no sleep. And this isn't just your regular protest. This is a daily haunting to make it clear that our generation is a force to be reckoned with when it comes to the revolution in the streets and at the ballot box.
My dream is that we bring these failed and corrupt institutions to their knees and we build something new. I love the term siege because I feel like that's exactly what we're going to do. And I'll encourage you to go read the Wikipedia page for what a siege is, because have that expectation. We need to tell the world that we're not taking this bullshit anymore, that they will see us, they will feel us, and they will hear us until they are deaf with our demands. Rome was not built in a day, and it was also not sieged in a day. In fact, it was sieged over the course of 1 year and 9 days, which was a fact I learned today. Every single day from now until the election is a day we're preparing for ballot time battle and the post-election eruption of our pent-up anger. That means showing up to houses of politicians everywhere who have failed us.
So for the next 100 days, we will haunt these architects of the death economy. We will march into their homes. We will march into their homes. We will march into their homes and make it plain and simple for them.
For change that's coming, we still have to deal with Biden, right? And I know literally every time I open the news, he's gone and said something else terrible. The Democratic Party is banging us over the head with, we got to defeat Trump. And this really speaks to me, right? We need an administration we can control. We need to be able to pull the strings if we want to be able to implement the visionary future we need.
So as we ramp up to the election, we know there's a lot that's going to be stopping Black and brown people and young people from voting. Polling places are being shut down, and we've heard that Trump has called for 50K poll watchers, which we all know that means there's going to be an army of terrorizers to scare Black and brown people from voting. It's going to...
Racism is integrally linked to capitalism, and I think it's a mistake to assume that we can combat racism by leaving capitalism in place. As Cedric Robinson pointed out in his book, Black Marxism, capitalism is racial capitalism. And of course, to just say for a moment that Marx pointed out that what he called primitive accumulation, capital doesn't just appear from nowhere. The original capital was provided by the labor of slaves. The Industrial Revolution, which pivoted around the production of capital, was enabled by slave labor in the U.S. So I'm convinced that the ultimate eradication of racism is going to require us to move toward a more socialist organization of our economies, of our other institutions. I think we have a long way to go before we can begin to talk about an economic system that is not based on exploitation and on the super exploitation of Black people, Latinx people, and other racialized populations. But I do think that we now have the conceptual means to engage in discussions, popular discussions about capitalism. Occupy gave us new language. The notion of the prison industrial complex requires us to understand the globalization of capitalism. Anti-capitalist consciousness helps us to understand the predicament of immigrants who are barred from the U.S. by the wall that has been created by the current occupant. These conditions have been created by global capitalism. And I think this is a period during which we need to begin that process of popular education, which will allow people to understand the interconnections of racism, heteropatriarchy, capitalism.
We can figure out how our communities can be resourced. That's not just about resourcing law enforcement.
So you're using this occasion to get more government finance or programs into the Black community?
Exactly.
But isn't that's one of the primary reasons that Black people are, not all but most, are so morally bankrupt, is because government has been taking care of them for the last 50 or 60 years or so? Government is hurting them rather than helping them. Why do you want more government programs in the Black community?
I think that it's, I don't know if it's government that's been morally bankrupt.
No, it's the government that has helped.
Morally bankrupt by the lack of government services.
No, not the lack of. Too much government support has devalued Black Americans.
I don't know if I agree with that. I think there hasn't been enough support. I think especially for me, growing up in Los Angeles, I grew up in poverty and watched my mother work 3+ jobs, barely was able to see her. And as I went to school, I witnessed how mostly communities of color, Black communities, were segregated even in our own schools, tracked into sort of lower education. And I think that the government hasn't actually done enough for Black people.
Amazing. Were you born out of wedlock?
No, I was not.
So your father was in the home?
Yes.
And yet the two of them could not raise a family?
Not with. I don't understand your question. Could not raise a family.
Did your father work?
Yes, he did. Yeah, he worked for GM Van Nuys.
And your mother worked as well?
She sure did.
Well, why were you poor?
I have no idea. I think because we live in a capitalist system that some people have a lot of wealth and some people don't.
You don't support capitalism?
I think what I support is families being able to feed their children regularly. And I think the current system that we live under doesn't allow for all families to live a life of dignity.
Do you support capitalism?
I support systems that support communities. And in this current government, it's not about capitalism or not. I think it's more about who's taken care of and who's not taken care of.
Do you support capitalism?
I'm not understanding your question.
Do you support capitalism or not?